Hello, I'm Fry.
And I'm Bree from Pontifex, a papal history podcast ranking all of the popes from Peter to Francis. In each episode, we explore the life of a single pope and contextualize their papacy in world history.
And then we rate them based on the success of their papacy, how scandalous they were, their impact on the secular world, what their face looked like, and more. They may even pick up a new patron sainthood on the way.
In the end, our most impactful papal bull-worthy popes will battle it out for the keys to the pearly gates and to be the popiest pope who ever poped.
You can find Pontifex at pontifex.podbean.com or wherever you find your podcasts, and on the Agora Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 20, Uncle and Nephew. You might notice that we have some new music. As much as I liked the previous intro music, I also felt that a change might be nice. So the current intro music is the overture from the opera Adelia by Gaetano Donizetti. Let me know what you think. I chose this opera for two reasons. First, I found myself in a bit of a romantic opera kick lately. And second, this opera takes place in the court of Duke Charles the Bold. Here's the tune to one of his entrances. Doesn't that sound grand? But as you can tell from the runtime, we have a lot to get into in this episode, so without further ado, on with the show. Last time we saw Philip the Bold and Louis of Orleans work to exclude each other from power in France. In late October 1401, Philip had been out of Paris for a few months, and Louis had used that time to solidify his position. The Duke of Orleans had removed men loyal to his uncle from posts in the administration and replaced them with his own minions, and he moved to promote policies which aided him and hurt Burgundy. But personnel and policy were not the only places that Louis left his mark. Orleans had also made sure to secure Paris itself. He was fairly unpopular in the capital, and so made sure that men loyal to him were placed in charge of many of the garrisons in and near the city. Furthermore, the Duke had a small army of retainers on hand. So when Philip resolved to return to Paris, he resolved to do so in force. The Duke of Burgundy was in Arras, in Artois, making preparations for the wedding of his second son Anthony to Joan of Saint-Pol, the daughter of Waleran of Saint-Pol, one of his most important vassals and best military commanders. While in Arras, Philip took counsel with his supporters and decided to march on the French capital. Tensions had been rising for years, but 1401 is when rivalry truly turned to enmity. The Duke of Orleans cultivated an alliance with the Duke of Guelders, who represented a significant threat to Philip's Low Country ambitions, and with the Dukes of Bar and Lorraine, in an attempt to control the lands between Philip's two territorial blocks. Philip, for his part, made his own alliances, against both Wenceslas, the deposed King of Germany and another ally of the Duke of Orleans, and the Duke of Milan, Louis's father-in-law. No longer was the conflict between uncle and nephew confined to the royal council. Now the stage was one of power politics, and magnates both within and without France were drawn into it. So in early December 1401, Philip returned to Paris, flanked by more than 600 soldiers. Over the next few weeks, more men loyal to the Duke of Burgundy arrived in the capital and set themselves up at or near Philip's residence, the Hôtel d'Artois, in the north of the city. Philip's entourage also included many regional allies, such as John of Bavaria, the Bishop of Liège, the Count of Namur, and the brother of the Duke of Lorraine. Meanwhile, Louis had set himself up at the Hôtel du Prévôt, also known as the Hôtel du Porc-Épée, near the Hôtel Saint-Pol, the main royal residence at the time. The Duke of Orleans was not going to sit by and watch Philip gather his forces, and so an arms race began. Louis called on his vassals for men, and soon enough, his own already not insignificant company of retainers was being reinforced. At any moment, Paris could have descended into urban warfare. Both dukes now commanded sizable private armies and were installed in their own fortresses. But civil war was not destined to break out in France, at least not in 1401-1402. After a month of rising tensions, the dukes agreed to meet with each other and submit to arbitration by Queen Isabeau with the help of the Dukes of Berry and Bourbon, and, after a little over a week of deliberations, Uncle and Nephew made peace. It is honestly doubtful whether or not Philip ever meant to start a war with Louis, as this was not his style. Rather, it seems that the Duke of Burgundy meant to use the threat of violence to limit Louis's plans to hamper the Burgundian position. Philip knew that he was getting old, and that every day Louis's position relative to him would grow stronger. Furthermore, he knew that there was little chance that his son John would inherit his position at the center of the French court. The Duke of Burgundy made assurances to keep his family close to the crown. After all, he had recently arranged for his granddaughter to marry the Dauphin. But when the Dauphin died, Philip's plans for the future suddenly became more uncertain. So by forcing Louis into arbitration, Philip could extract promises from his nephew that would hopefully limit his ambitions and protect Burgundy when her dukes no longer held Philip's level of influence. But a lot of this is speculation, and if Philip's plan all along was to force Louis into arbitration, it's hard to say how effective it was. The agreement brokered by Isabeau can't really be described as a Burgundian triumph over Orléans. Really, the agreement mostly served as an excuse for both parties to dismiss their men and save face. With Philip back in the capital, he was able to use his naturally stronger political position and gravitas to reassert control over the court, but he was unable to gain any firm commitments from Louis to limit his ambitions. The dukes broke bread together and resolved to remain friendly with each other forever. While Philip did not come to blows with his nephew, the agreement did little other than to restore the status quo, and in the future, these issues will reassert themselves. Not long after Philip and Louis made peace, the Duke of Burgundy's position was once again threatened as Charles regained his sanity. Louis took this opportunity to try and restore France to Avignon, but Philip and his brother John were not about to let that happen. Several threats, veiled and not so veiled, were passed between uncles and nephew, and in the end 3 delegations were sent to Avignon to sort the situation out. One from the Duke of Berry, one from the Duke of Orléans, and one from the king to try and keep the other 2 delegations in line. Louis had also been complaining that his appanage was smaller than those of his uncles, and so with Charles sane once again, Louis made an attempt to convince his brother to give him more land. But, as Charles was sane, he could clearly see that the royal domain had been significantly shrunk by the princes of the blood. While the king did end up agreeing to give the Duke of Orléans some more lands, this period does mark the beginning of an attempt by the royal government to recover parts of the royal domain. However, the princes royal were exempt from this audit, and so the biggest beneficiaries of royal largesse had their lands untouched. The uncles and Louis both worked to limit each other's access to the king, but when Philip had to return to his lands in March, the job of interfering with the Duke of Orléans' plans was given to the Duke of Berry. Philip made sure to sign another peace agreement with Louis before he left Paris, but that would not limit his nephew's ambitions. While Philip was out of town, Louis convinced his brother to put him in charge of all extraordinary taxation in the north of France, and furthermore convinced Charles to levy a new aid for Louis to collect. While Philip claimed innocence in this new tax by virtue of being away from court, rumors swirled of a large bribe reaching the Duke of Burgundy, along with news of the tax. Philip, for his part, acknowledged that the offer of a bribe had been made, but claimed that he refused it. He made sure to publicize his opposition to the new tax. While in his younger days, the Duke of Burgundy championed several taxes, he now saw that his dynastic plans were better served by opposing the high taxes. I don't want to give the impression that Philip was now turning his nose up at royal gifts, but the Duke of Burgundy was less reliant on royal largesse than the Duke of Orléans was due to the relative wealth of their territories. Moreover, we already saw Philip positioning himself as a champion of good government in his letter to the Paris Parlement last episode. As the iron grasp that the Burgundians held on the royal court begins to loosen, Philip and later his son John will see their interests better served by publicly pushing for lower taxes and a reduction of graft. Now, I'm sure the irony was not lost on them, but hey, that's politics. Another conflict between uncle and nephew now took place. but this time the stage was the royal council rather than the streets of Paris. In the end, to keep the peace, Philip was given joint control over extraordinary taxation with Louis, the two agreed to share power during Charles' absences, and the Queen's position as mediator between the two was reaffirmed. The tax proposed by Louis was cancelled, and a good thing too, as it represented an increase of over 50% of the current tax burden, and would have almost certainly sparked a tax revolt. But the cancellation of the tax was furthermore good news to Philip, as the reason for this tax, apart from graft, was to fund a French invasion of England. More on that shortly. A more serious threat to the peace between Burgundy and Orléans arose not long after the affair of taxation had been dealt with, in the Imperial Duchy of Luxembourg. Philip had been administering Luxembourg on behalf of Jost of Moravia for the past year, despite his support for rivals of Jost's family. Jost technically did not inherit Luxembourg, but rather he had mortgaged the duchy from his cousin Wenceslas, the king of Bohemia and one of the two men claiming to be king of Germany. So in August of 1492, Philip's officials were kicked out of the duchy, and Jost sold his mortgage to Louis, making the Duke of Orléans the Duke of Luxembourg. The reason for Jost's about-face, unsurprisingly, can be traced back to Wenceslas. At first, when Wenceslas was deposed, Jost had ambitions of his own to take Bohemia from his cousin. Therefore, the Margrave of Moravia not only had no interest in supporting his cousin's claim to Germany, he also did not want to be distracted by events in the Duchy of Luxembourg. Due to Philip's possession of the neighboring county of Rethel and the two's previous diplomatic connections, Philip was a good choice to take over the rule of Luxembourg. However, earlier in 1402, Wenceslas's brother and King of Hungary Sigismund made his own move to take control of Bohemia. Now Jost would have to supplant the much stronger Sigismund if he wanted to rule Bohemia, so Jost needed more money, hence the decision to sell his mortgage on Luxembourg. As there was a difference between temporarily handing the administration of Luxembourg to another and actually selling his mortgage on it, Jost knew that he could not allow the family duchy to fall into the hands of a supporter of the Wittelsbach Rupert. Furthermore, as now Jost was not directly competing with Wenceslas, he also knew that his interests in Bohemia now were best served by strengthening Wenceslas's position rather than weakening it. Therefore, Louis of Orléans, a prominent supporter of his cousin, was Jost's best choice. In a less Machiavellian interpretation of Jost's motives, it is possible that by granting the administration of Luxembourg to Philip, the Luxembourger prince hoped to win the Duke of Burgundy over to his family's side. However, as Philip continued to support Rupert, Jost decided that the duchy was best kept in the hands of an ally of the House of Luxembourg. Luxembourg was tucked between Philip's northern and southern territories. Therefore, Luxembourg being controlled by a rival weakened the Duke of Burgundy's geopolitical position. Furthermore, Philip had considered Luxembourg within his sphere of influence and had plans of his own to annex the duchy. Louis's acquisition of the duchy was thus a provocation close to home. But Philip wasn't the only one who Louis was alienating at this time. King Henry IV of England was about to lose his last supporter in the French court. After Richard II's fall in 1399, most of the French court viewed the new king as a regicide, a usurper, and an illegitimate ruler. Henry was loathed by Philip the Bold and by King Charles, with the latter even proposing to send soldiers to support a rebellion against the Lancastrian king. However, while Philip the Bold had largely given Henry Bolingbroke the cold shoulder while he was in Paris and openly opposed his expedition back to England, more than anything else, the Duke of Burgundy wanted to maintain peace. So while the King of England was seen in a very poor light by Philip and his party, at no point was the subject of repudiating the Truce of Lollingham seriously brought up. Conversely, Louis of Orléans had supported Bolingbroke during his Parisian exile and returned to England. Although it is unlikely that the Duke of Orléans knew that Henry intended to overthrow his cousin, again, it's unlikely that Bolingbroke himself knew that he would do so when he first left France. Louis saw Henry's rise to power as a win which would serve his interests by harming those of his uncles. After the Lancastrian coup, tensions were definitely higher between England and France, but neither king saw a return to hostilities as beneficial. Tensions were further increased by the status of the young Queen Dowager Isabella. As Richard had died before their marriage had been consummated, according to the Truce of Lollingham, Isabella was supposed to return to France along with her dowry. Henry suggested that Isabella be wed to his own son, Prince Hal, but due to his poor standing at the French court, there was a lot of pushback to that, including from Isabella herself, who genuinely liked Richard and had no desire to wed the son of his usurper. While Henry was willing, although unhappily so, to return Isabella to her homeland, he steadfastly refused to return her dowry, as quite frankly, he needed the money too badly. Isabella returned to France in 1401, but the negotiations surrounding that return were noticeably tenser than those which had occurred under Richard II. And funnily enough, Isabella wasn't the only child of Charles who contributed to the decaying relationship between the two courts. In 1401, while the negotiations around Isabella were happening, the Dauphin Charles died, and so the next oldest son of the king, Louis, was made the Dauphin. But along with Dauphin, Louis also gained the title Duke of Guienne. It is likely that giving Dauphin Louis the title of Duke of Guienne was engineered by Philip the Bold as a way to prevent Louis of Orleans from possibly gaining Guienne in the future. The political state of England at the time was incredibly shaky, and it was not unlikely that Henry IV would be forced to pull soldiers out of France to deal with his Scottish War and Welsh Rebellion. However, Henry IV saw the conferring of that title as a provocation and did not appreciate his claim to Guienne being used in French politics. And so as 1401 ticked over to 1402, a return to war seemed more and more likely. Which brings us back to Louis of Orleans. For as much as Philip the Bold's interests were served by maintaining peace, Louis were now served by a return to arms. Not only would a war weaken the Burgundian economic and political position in Flanders, it would also give Louis a chance to expand his territory at the expense of the English. For a while, there was no true war party in the French court. While there were those in the army that lived for combat, their political power was generally negligible. But now, as the reputation of the English king was reaching a new low in Paris, there began to be more calls for a return to hostilities. Many young nobles, who did not live through the disasters of the first phase of the 100 Years' War, wanted the chance to prove and enrich themselves on campaign, and these men now lined up behind the Duke of Orleans. Louis began to provide Henry's enemies in England, Wales, and Scotland with aid, but this was all done without the sanction of the French court. The Duke of Orleans set about trying to spark a conflict between France and England, hoping that like a young noble dressed in a suit of flax, wax, and pitch, a spark would cause the 100 Years' War to erupt once more. But while Louis's position at court in 1402 was undoubtedly strong, he did not yet have the ability to drag France back into war over Philip the Bold's objections. The king and the uncles all swore oaths that they had every intention of maintaining the Truce of Lollingham, and furthermore, as the specter of war loomed on the horizon, French and English diplomats continued to meet there to try and sort things out, even as the task looked more and more hopeless. However, war in this period was just as often a private affair as it was a public one. As tensions increased between England and France, the first casualty of the renewed conflict was commerce. Privateers holding letters of marque began to roam the Channel, much to the dismay of the merchants of Bruges and the cloth workers of Ghent and Ypres. Piracy in this period was nothing new. Philip had been complaining to Albert of Bavaria about Zealander pirates since the late 1390s, but in 1402 the threat of English piracy loomed large in the minds of the Flemish. Not only did English piracy pose a greater threat than Zealander piracy in its own right, but, if left unchecked, English piracy and the resulting breakdowns of civility between France and England would likely end up being followed by an interruption of the wool trade. To be fair to the English, French and Flemish pirates also took part in this escalation, but that just made the situation more dangerous. So as English privateers disrupted Flemish commerce, Philip knew that satisfaction had to be assured. The Duke of Burgundy first planned to conduct reprisals on English merchants in Flanders, but the Flemings feared future commercial disruption more than they feared English piracy, so refused to cooperate with the potential seizure of goods. Therefore, a complicated balancing of interests was needed. The Flemish wanted to preserve peace and trade between Flanders and England, and to end the piracy in the English Channel and North Sea from both English and French-backed privateers, while the French wanted either peace or war depending on who you asked, but knew that the threat of war was ever present and wanted to be ready to face down a potential invasion. And so, Philip was torn between his roles as Count of Flanders and Prince of France. As the townsfolk of Flanders always had their own relationship with the English, it was inevitable that some sort of Anglo-Flemish agreement would be negotiated. So the 4 members of Flanders sent a party of diplomats to Calais to begin talks to negotiate a commercial treaty between England and Flanders. These negotiations, while not happening on Philip's behalf, also weren't happening without his sanction. The Count of Flanders had not taken part in these negotiations at Calais, as, in all honesty, they really didn't concern him. Philip the Bold had little interest in interrupting Anglo-Flemish commerce, as that commerce is what provided him with a large part of his wealth. So as long as Philip wasn't determined to shut down English commerce in his territories, he wasn't necessary to the process. So Philip gave his support to these negotiations, or at the very least did not hamper them. And in early 1403, an agreement was reached which protected Flemish shipping from English piracy and English goods from seizure by Flemish officials. Philip ended up agreeing to the treaty, and even further, when prompted by the representatives from the four members, agreed to lobby King Charles for a wider policy of Flemish neutrality. Philip managed to secure for his county an agreement that unless the English invaded Flanders, that the Flemish would not be forced to take up arms against the English, allow French armies to pass through Flanders, or allow French ships to use Flemish ports as staging grounds to attack England. But while the Flemish received this guarantee, Philip promised his nephew the king that Flemish ports would be available to use to stage an English invasion if necessary. Philip was always going to pursue his subjects' interests only so far as they corresponded with his own. As Anglo-Flemish negotiations continued while Anglo-French tensions continued to increase, there began to be some instances where Philip opposed the actions of the representatives of the four members. So Philip sent his own representatives to Calais to make sure that the Flemings did not cross any red lines. Furthermore, while there were some minor conflicts between Philip and his Flemish towns during this period, including Ghent chasing Philip's sovereign bailiff of Flanders out of town, it appears that these instances were separate from any power struggles that related to Anglo-French tensions. When Philip and the four members pursued contradictory aims, such as when Philip confiscated some English goods at Sluis over the objections of the Flemings, or when the Flemings ordered the disbanding of a small war fleet which Philip had allowed to dock in Flemish ports, it was more to the Count and his subjects having different interests than it was a power struggle in Flanders. There was no talk of rebellion at this point, and there would be no third Van Artevelde. Despite not being totally aligned, Philip and the four members of Flanders were determined to work together to preserve Flemish commerce as war loomed on the horizon. But while Philip made sure to be a partner that the four members of Flanders could work with, he had no such relationship with Louis of Orleans. Now it seemed that every issue was a battlefield where Burgundy and Orleans jockeyed for position. And in the early 1400s, three of the most critical battlefields were Brittany, Avignon, and the royal family. So let's start with Brittany. When we last left the duchy, John of Montfort and Olivia de Clisson had reconciled in 1396. This reconciliation was facilitated by Philip the Bold, and was part of a larger reconciliation between the Montfort and Ponthièvre factions. Unfortunately for John of Montfort, he did not have long to catch up with his old friend turned bitter rival turned friend again, as he died in 1399. The new Duke of Brittany, another John, was only 10 at the time of his father's death, and so a regency was needed. Initially, the regency of Brittany was taken up by the young duke's mother, Joan of Navarre. The Dowager Duchess of Brittany was a skilled politician and an able administrator, and there would have likely been no regency crisis if it weren't for affairs of the heart. In 1402, King Henry IV of England married Joan of Navarre, and not long after she stepped down from the regency and began preparations to go to England. By this point, John V was only a year and a half shy of reaching the age of majority, and so the Queen of England figured that as Olivia de Clisson had been helping her rule Brittany for the past few years, that he could hold the duchy together until John was old enough to rule in his own right. And if the political situation in Paris wasn't so tense, it is possible that Philip the Bold would have allowed this to happen. While the Duke of Burgundy wasn't a huge fan of the former constable of France, Olivia de Clisson wasn't in direct competition with him for power anymore, and besides, the two had gotten along okay, if not great, for the past few years. However, de Clisson was a friend and ally of the Duke of Orleans, and so letting Brittany fall into the Orleanist camp was unacceptable to Philip. The Duke of Burgundy was helped in his cause by the old scars of the War of Breton Succession. While de Clisson had many allies in the duchy, he also had many enemies, and so these quickly fell in line behind Philip. Philip was able to leverage his support in the duchy and his influence in the royal council to displace de Clisson and get named regent for John V. The decision was met with some resistance from Olivier de Clisson and the members of the Ponthièvre faction, but in the end, the most vigorous opposition to Philip's regency came from Louis of Orleans rather than the Bretons. De Clisson was definitely unhappy at being displaced, but there was little that he could do, and resisting Philip, who was backed at the time by the king, at least in name, would have undoubtedly backfired. While Philip pursued a policy of appeasement with regards to the English in Flanders, his position towards the English in Brittany was far more aggressive, likely due to it not interfering with his bottom line. Philip gained control of the Peninsular Duchy in late 1402, and by then it was clear that the conflict would resume shortly. Therefore, Brittany was put to the service of assuring France's strategic position. Trade with England, which Philip had gone to great lengths to protect in Flanders, was cut off in Brittany. Piracy was not unknown between Brittany and England during Joan's regency, despite her obviously close ties with England, but under Philip, Breton pirates began roaming the Channel more than ever before. The ports of Brittany, which the English had seized during the War of Breton Succession, and which the French had secured in the Truce of Lollingham, were used as outposts to harass English shipping and outfit naval vessels. Although Philip would only rule over Brittany for a little over a year, he ended his regency by appointing several officers and leaving detailed instructions for the government of the duchy, so that even after stepping down, his mark would remain. Philip, despite his goals of assuring peace to protect the English wool trade, was not going to pursue peace to the detriment of France's strategic position, especially if he could do so without harming the aforementioned wool trade. After all, only Flemish neutrality was being negotiated, not Philip's neutrality. While Philip had been wildly successful with his aims in Brittany, he and his brother John were less so with regards to the Avignon papacy. Back in 1402, Louis had tried to restore France's obedience to Avignon, but had been outmaneuvered by his uncles. The French had withdrawn their support from Avignon back in 1398, and besieged Pope Benedict XIII in his papal palace. France did not switch their allegiance to Rome, but Benedict's legitimacy did suffer. However, in 1403, events conspired to give Louis an upper hand. First, Benedict managed to escape his confinement, and second, Philip had to spend much of 1403 out of Paris. Benedict did not go far and remained in Provence, now under the protection of Louis of Anjou, who still recognized the Avignon papacy. Benedict's escape occurred shortly before a council of the French Church was set to take place. This council had been originally called to ratify the withdrawal from Avignon, but Louis of Orleans knew that he could use news of Benedict's escape to his advantage. Louis had been in close contact with the Avignonese pontiff during the siege, and had been able to secure guarantees from Benedict to take a more reconciliatory position going forward, and agree to submit to a general church council in order to sort out the schism. This was quite the volte-face from Benedict, who had spent most of his papacy thus far as high-handed and domineering, but in reality these guarantees carried little weight. Still though, they were enough to convince a number of important French clerics that Benedict had turned over a new leaf, and a delegation of bishops led by Louis of Orleans went to the king with a list of clerics now in favor of returning to Avignon. While Benedict had become more and more unpopular in France in the years leading up to the initial withdrawal, many saw their opinions of him soften during his imprisonment in Avignon. The Pope was now seen as a less aggressive and more pitiable figure. Furthermore, by a stroke of luck, the council coincided with both Philip and John's absence from Paris, and of a period of sanity for King Charles, so Louis's influence over his brother was about as high as it could be. Without the interference of Philip and John, Charles was convinced by his brother. Soon enough, France was restored to the obedience of the Avignon papacy, and the schism was no closer to being resolved. Berry and Burgundy tried to reverse Charles' decision once again, but they were too late, and the king's mind was made up. And so we've seen both Philip and Louis secure wins in the battle over control of the realm. But two battles had the potential to decide the whole game, those over the next generation and of a possible regency. Over the past few years, the subject of a regency had been brought up time and again. After all, Charles had begun his rule as a child king, and with his mental state so shaky, he couldn't be expected to live forever, and a regency could also possibly go into effect during the king's absences. So Philip and Louis began a long back-and-forth battle over what a potential regency would look like. According to a royal proclamation from 1402, when the king was mad, Queen Isabeau was to act as the chair of the royal council, and to decide things when a consensus could not be reached. The queen's role here was supposed to be as a mediator and representative of the king's interests, but when she tried a little too hard to get her brother Louis of Bavaria appointed as the Constable of France, Charles began to worry that she would pursue her own interests ahead of the kingdom's, or if you prefer, his interests. It should be noted that this ordinance did not call for the establishment of a regency. Rather, the queen's role was to sit in for the king and make sure that Burgundy and Orléans weren't constantly at each other's throats. At the time that this ordinance was issued, the royal council already controlled the kingdom during Charles's absences. This proclamation was mostly issued to get everything straight. Furthermore, the king proclaimed that if he were to die when the Dauphin was still a minor, in this case under the age of 14, that there would be no official regency. Rather, the new king was to be crowned immediately, and France would be ruled in his name. Isabeau was to be the guardian of the young king, as well as of the other royal children, and the royal council was to take care of the actual running of the kingdom. Philip and Isabeau supported these maneuvers, as they tended to favor the queen and the Burgundian position. However, Louis of Orléans had managed to wrangle the promise of being regent from his brother a few years earlier and vehemently opposed this plan. Still, this ordinance did not disempower the Duke of Orléans. The Duke of Orléans, like the Duke of Burgundy, sat permanently on the royal council, and both men had now spent years stacking it with their partisans whenever given the opportunity. This plan would merely have Orléans and Burgundy continuing their competition with Isabeau as a referee. So going forward, Louis, and then in response Philip and Isabeau, began to lobby the king to make changes to this arrangement. The queen had her power limited, then expanded again, then limited once more. Councillors loyal to one party or another were alternately appointed and dismissed from the council, and all sorts of other minor changes designed to favor the uncles or the nephew were proposed, accepted, and revoked. Louis then managed to get the ordinance organizing the council revoked, and was able to get himself named regent once more. But then Philip, John, and Isabeau all successfully pressured the king to return to the original plan. As I said earlier, there were many more issues that faced the royal council in the early 1400s, such as the prospect of appointing a new constable of France, or officers of the Chambre des Comptes, and all of them became battles between Burgundy and Orléans. At one point, when the king was absent, the Dukes of Berry and Bourbon and the queen had to ban both Orléans and Burgundy from attending council meetings until the king regained his sanity, as their arguments had begun to monopolize the meetings and prevent any real business from being discussed. Sometimes Burgundy would win and sometimes Orléans would, but it was clear to all that Orléans was getting his way far more now than he had in the previous decade. If the issue of the regency had been solved, at least for now, the next place that the dukes looked to secure their position was through the king's children. Back in 1396, Philip had arranged for his granddaughter, Margaret of Navarre, to marry the Dauphin, but in 1401 these plans were dashed when the Dauphin died. Philip wanted Mary to marry the new Dauphin, Louis of Guienne, but the Duke of Orléans had his own plans for his nephew. However, in this matchmaking struggle, Philip came out victorious. He not only got Charles to agree to betroth Louis of Guienne to Margaret of Navarre, but he also arranged for Margaret's brother Philip, the future Philip the Good, to marry Michelle, one of Charles's daughters, for Louis's younger brother John to marry another of John of Navarre's daughters, and for Charles's youngest son, another Charles, to wed Jacqueline of Bavaria, another of Philip's grandchildren. The Duke of Burgundy thus assured that the royal family and the Burgundians would be closely tied together, and no matter how a regency might shake out, Burgundian power over the realm would remain even after Philip's death. For his part, Louis visited his brother alone and convinced the king to revoke this marriage contract and issue a new one. But Philip responded by going to the king and having him revoke the revocation. And this is how many of these political battles would go. If the king was mad, they would battle it out in the royal council, and if the king was sane, both parties would ply him to their side through convincing, bringing allies, or presenting gifts. However, Charles spent much of his time in this period in a state that really couldn't be classified as either. He still recognized those closest to him and had some judgment, but the king was exhausted all the time. His memory often failed him, so that he could not remember what he agreed to just a few days ago, and he was easily persuaded by whoever talked to him last. And it was in this state, with the king giving the outward appearance of being able to rule, that the uncles and Orléans were able to do so much damage to the realm. Not only did they plunder lands from the royal domain and take money from the royal treasury, but the constant back and forth of the royal position damaged the ability of the French state to run itself. Allies of one party or another, both inside and outside the kingdom, would receive royal support one day and royal wrath the next. Taxes would be declared and recalled. Officials would be sent on assignment and then fired or reassigned. Plans would be made and unmade. In these years, it is impossible to say that there was a French policy platform, only a Burgundian and an Orleanist one. To put matters in perspective, most of the arrangements about the royal marriages and the regency happened in about a 2-month window in April and May 1403, and I didn't even include all the proclamations and revocations that took part in these arrangements. Seemingly, each day, a different party would get their way. But the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans could agree that conflict with England was once more on the horizon. Here, Orleans was an enthusiastic promoter of said conflict, while Burgundy was far more hesitant to return to war. Louis of Orleans and Henry IV spent the early 1400s writing each other increasingly hostile letters, and piracy between England and France had reached a fever pitch. And now, throughout 1303, tensions between England and France continued to escalate. When a serious English rebellion flared up in 1403 and made common cause with an ongoing Welsh rebellion, a French expeditionary force decided to try and help bring Henry IV down. There is no indication that this force was sanctioned by the crown, or even by any of the princes of the blood, but it does go to show that there were many in France who yearned for Henry Bolingbroke's downfall. While this force did help the Welsh in their rising, in the long term it did little to change the situation, other than to further alienate England and France. King Henry responded by assembling a privateering fleet and unleashing them on the Atlantic coast of France. Meanwhile, Waleran of Luxembourg, the Count of Saint-Pol, was making his own plans to take on the English. Despite now being a loyal vassal of the French, or at least of Philip, Waleran of Luxembourg had spent much of his youth aligned with the English, even marrying the half-sister of Richard II and becoming a Knight of the Garter. In 1380, Waleran made peace with Charles V, but there were many who suspected his sympathies. We mostly know the Count of Saint-Pol as one of Philip's vassals and generals, but Waleran of Luxembourg was a major lord and landowner in Flanders, Artois, and Picardy in his own right. The Count of Saint-Pol had been a useful go-between to facilitate unofficial conversations between the English and French courts, and had played some part in the negotiations around the Truce of Lolingham. So whether to prove his loyalty to France or to avenge his brother-in-law, Waleran of Luxembourg began planning his own expedition against the English. Soon enough, the Count assembled a fleet of close to 200 ships and a small army in Normandy. But rather than sail for England as was expected, Waleran of Luxembourg instead sailed around France to blockade Bordeaux. This operation was concurrent with a land-based blockade of Calais, also masterminded by Waleran. Rather than England itself, the goal of the Count of Saint-Pol was to remove the English from the continent. But England would not have to wait long to meet Waleran of Luxembourg. While his 2 blockades were still ongoing, the Count of Saint-Pol took another set of ships with his army towards Britain. However, he would not make it to the island, instead landing on and briefly occupying the Isle of Wight. In the end, the Count's expedition accomplished no more than the earlier French sally to Wales did, other than to move the proverbial doomsday clock 1 tick closer to midnight. While the Duke of Burgundy protested his innocence and desire to remain at peace with England, it is likely that he at least approved of the hostile measures. While there is no evidence linking him to the Count of Saint-Pol's campaign, I find it hard to believe that the Count was simply assembling a huge army and fleet right under Philip's nose without his knowledge, as most of these preparations occurred in Flanders or Artois. Furthermore, Breton piracy, culminating with the sack of the port town of Plymouth, was equally, if not more damaging to England, and Philip the Bold was still in charge of the duchy. True, these expeditions were also private affairs, but once more, I expect that they had received nods of approval from Philip at the very least. And so as 1403 ticked over to 1404, the royal court had made the decision not to renew the Truce of Lolingham. While I believe that Philip the Bold still preferred peace with England to war, by now conflict appeared to be inevitable, and if it was, he could at least try to pry Calais away from the English. For his part, Louis of Orleans had plans to extend his reach towards English possessions in the southwest, and possibly gain control of Guyenne, despite Charles's attempts to keep it from his grasp by granting it to his son the Dauphin. So while the talks at Lolingham were set to continue on the 1st of March, no French delegation showed up. The Truce of Lollingham had been repudiated, and in early April 1404, a small French expeditionary force landed in England. This force, however, would also not accomplish anything of note. In fact, despite the 100 Years' War technically being back on, England and France would not see much large-scale conflict over the next few years, other than small-scale raiding and the occasional half-hearted attempt to seize Guyenne. Actually, let me rephrase that. England and France would not see much conflict with each other over the next few years. Both kingdoms will have plenty of conflict in the near future. But at least the Flemish had their commercial treaty, so Philip wasn't at risk of facing another urban revolt. However, the Duke of Burgundy was at risk from the flu, as the disease was sweeping through the Low Countries at the time. At 62 years old, Philip the Bold was no longer the youth that had vigorously defended his father at the Battle of Poitiers. He had lost little of his energy or forcefulness as he aged, but he had definitely aged. Philip caught the flu while traveling to Brussels. The Duke of Burgundy was making arrangements to finally take control of Brabant after years of negotiations with the estates of the duchy and with the Duchess Joan. However, Philip would not end up receiving Brabant in his lifetime. The Duke of Burgundy decided to return to his territories. As a testament both to his wealth and power and to his ill health, Philip employed men to smooth the road ahead of his carriage to make his journey more comfortable. But he still could not travel for long, and he stopped for the night at the town of Hall, not far from Brussels. Philip the Bold died the next day. The man who had dominated French politics since 1380 was now gone, and it was finally time for a new generation to take over. Louis of Orleans would now step into his uncle's place as master of the royal council, while John the Fearless gained control over the emerging Burgundian state. Both of these transitions set the stage for the coming era of conflict that France would face. As Richard Vaughan writes, quote, "While the merits of Philip the Bold as a statesman are undisputed, his outlook and aims are still a subject for controversy. We saw Philip ruthlessly use France's resources to build his Burgundian state, seizing between an eighth and a sixth of the kingdom's annual revenue at times. He steered French policy and French military to serve his ends. And it is hard to gauge Philip's motives here. Obviously, he was incredibly self-serving, but at a certain point, where do his interests truly diverge from that of France's? As the son, brother, and uncle of French kings, Philip saw his own aggrandizement as a self-evident good, and those inclined to defend his actions, such as Christine de Pizan, can claim that his expansion into imperial territories served to expand the reach of France as well. That is why John the Good and Charles V worked so hard to make him Count Palatine of Burgundy and Count of Flanders after all. But that motivation rings a bit hollow. Philip's ultimate goals were not French, they were Burgundian. Every prince of the blood was taking the opportunity to gain everything they could at the expense of the French state. Philip just happened to be the best at it. On the other hand, while Philip's constant pursuit of peace with England was largely motivated by Flemish commercial interests, the peace was beneficial to France when in place. Philip may have been greedy, but he was a talented diplomat and administrator. The cost of his services may have been immense and ultimately overpriced, but he did serve France well and did much to further the kingdom's interests, with his furthered along the way. I think that Philip was always looking out for French interests until they conflicted with Burgundian ones. Admittedly, the answer to what French interests were likely differed, depending on if you asked Philip, Louis, the king, or even a random French peasant. We do see that there are many cases throughout his life where the Duke of Burgundy worked diligently on behalf of the French state, and for the most part, he was able to simultaneously further his own and France's interests. He was well served by having France as a strong kingdom, and, at least in his mind, France was well served by having a powerful Duke of Burgundy. And that was one of the biggest effects of the death of Philip the Bold. The future Burgundian dukes will never be quite as plugged into the royal court as Philip was, and will ultimately not see their interests as closely tied with France's as Philip did. John the Fearless will soon try to reassert the Burgundian position in Paris, but he was not his father, and the times, they were changing. Thank you to my patrons: Christine, Comte de Chenonceau, Elliot, Graf von Kravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, James, Graf von Temsa, and Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau. And thank you to my Knights of the Duchy: If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.